Hello folks, I wanted to make a quick take video, although given my track record we'll see how long this video eventually turns out being. I'm hoping to keep it under 20 if I possibly can. But nevertheless, I wanted to comment on a few things that have been going on Twitter and on YouTube. As most people know, there was a quite prominent debate between the philosopher Slavoj Zizek and the internet celebrity / psychologist Jordan Peterson. A lot of people wanted me to comment on this debate immediately when it came out on Good Friday, but given the Easter holidays, I just didn't have time to watch it. Moreover, I had the sneaking suspicion that I knew exactly how it would go. Jordan Peterson is a person that has a very understandable way of putting things. He has a plain way of speaking that has apparently captivated a large number of young men in my generation. As almost a complete contrast, Slavoj Zizek seems almost humorously impenetrable. He's quite a character in his own right, a type of European intellectual that I just don't think you find at European universities anymore. You see his mannerisms and temperament and just know instantly that he would be a nightmare for any modern American HR department at a university. I've followed both these men in their intellectual careers in passing, although I haven't really delved into the deep cuts on either one of them. I still haven't completely finished Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning, and it's been ages since I picked up and read The Puppet and the Dwarf, Slavoj Zizek's quite unorthodox take on Christianity. Although I thoroughly enjoyed it, I certainly don't feel like I understood it. Nevertheless, I felt I understood what kinds of people these two men were, and what kind of interaction they were likely going to have. Peterson, with his careful and plodding tone, would likely lay out some rationalistic and reasonable approach to understanding the problems, in this case the relationship of happiness, capitalism, and communism, while as Slavoj Zizek would likely lay out a huge tract of language and examples of interesting counterpoints and paradoxes, and then use the situation to come up with something that seemed profound and maybe even was profound. At any rate, Zizek would be by far the more crafty of the two individuals. And as such, optically at least, he was likely to come out the victor, at least compared to the persona of Peterson, which would, in my imagination, likely seem to be antiquated, not as agile, and somewhat unimaginative in comparison to the much more vivacious Zizek. And hearing about the debate afterwards, it more or less confirmed my preconceptions of it. Once I logged back onto Twitter after my Lenten fast, I found my entire feed just crammed with all of the communists I followed, going on endlessly about how Jordan Peterson was really shown up by the keen intellectual sensibilities of Zizek. He had a better understanding of the problems of the modern world, one that ultimately vindicated their Marxist approach to the world. Now, initially I had a huge hesitancy to make some kind of response video to Zizek versus Peterson for two reasons. The first is that it would be almost impossible not to make the video about communism and Marxism. That was the topic of their debate, explicitly, if not implicitly. And I was already embroiled in some online conflicts with Marxists, ones that I was fairly certain would result in future response videos and deeper debunkings of the Marxist errors in thought. I really didn't want this channel to become Why Marxism is Wrong YouTube. Moreover, I had already promised a full video dedicated to Jordan Peterson's mistakes and where I felt he had gone wrong taking on the modern project. In essence, any analysis of a debate between Zizek and Peterson on communism would likely be filled with redundant ideas that I would likely just repeat again in future videos. I think my interest in watching the Peterson versus Zizek debate further tanked once I heard the real gotcha moment that every communist was repeating on Twitter and on other social media where I followed them. The moment that showed that Zizek had the better vision, the better understanding of modernity than did Peterson. The moment that really made him look like a fool and showed him up for the intellectual fraud that he was. Besides, if you watch Thought Slime or ContraPoints or any number of the LeftTube people, you'll know that Jordan Peterson really isn't a very serious thinker, and hasn't really given any good introspection to the topics of serious leftists in the academy. And the moment that confirmed this perception was when Slavoj Zizek asked Jordan Peterson, "Who are these cultural Marxists?" And Jordan Peterson didn't have a good answer. He didn't have the names on hand, the smoking gun of cultural Marxism in the academy. And that just showed that Jordan Peterson was chasing ghosts all throughout his career, taking on the radical left in academia. That's it, folks. Nothing to see here. No cultural Marxists. Move along. This was very much the narrative I heard from the left, and it was easy to believe. Jordan Peterson, as I pointed out earlier, certainly isn't the most agile thinker, certainly not compared to Slavoj Zizek, and it was easy to see him possibly getting caught flat-footed by this question. The assertion, of course, that cultural Marxism is some kind of conspiracy theory, that there really are no postmodern Marxists, and the people that came up with this identity politics, white privilege, oppression narrative academic style had no relationship to Marx is frankly ridiculous. Anyone who understands how to use a bibliography, or even Google Scholar, can understand in a very short amount of time that the people who developed this theory, and the people who influenced those who developed the theory, had thoroughgoing Marxist sympathies, if not being explicitly communist in their political persuasions. This is further evidenced in the fact that most modern Marxists, at least on LeftTube and the places that are prominent in social media, never really take on the intellectual style that has come to dominate intellectual life in the academy. Perhaps we can just chalk this up to most prominent leftists being well organized enough to not air these grievances publicly, but you certainly don't hear any condemnation of standpoint theory, toxic masculinity, or epistemic privilege from those who make up the modern Marxists on YouTube. But nevertheless, the line you usually get from serious intellectual leftists when confronted with identity politics and grievance studies is to essentially deny that it really is a thing in a very prominent way. The parts like cultural appropriation that they can't explicitly defend in any dialectic sense are excused as conservative scaremongering. And when it came right down to it, when it came to Jordan Peterson, their favorite canard was to critique the language that Jordan Peterson had to describe his opponents in the academy. Postmodern neo-Marxists? Don't you know that's a contradiction in terms? I mean, classical Marxism is a modernist theory, so how can you be postmodern and Marxist? Frankly, as I said before, this is pure pedantry. Ideas do evolve, and I think as we will see later in this talk, there is more to Marxism that apparently meets the eye. So, regardless of all this background, I had a lot of trepidation going into watching this debate. I didn't like the idea that a moment where Jordan Peterson got caught flat-footed would be used as evidence that his talking points against academic progressivism were ultimately in poor faith. I might have very large ideological differences with Peterson himself, but any opportunity for leftist academics to cover their tracks is a loss in my book. But when I finally got around to watching the debate, I found something entirely different than what I expected. Sure enough, this debate was in this huge auditorium, and as you might expect for two intellectual celebrities, perhaps the two intellectual celebrities of their age, it was just packed full. You could hear one side was firmly in Jordan Peterson's camp, another was firmly in Zizek's camp, and they broadly broke up along left versus right, the leftists for Zizek, and the right-wingers, or what passes for right-wingers, for Jordan Peterson. For a moment, it almost felt like a sports team. I kind of imagined the auditorium split up where each of the fans were wearing their colors because after each person made their points, you heard sort of audible cheers and claps from the various sides, the various political camps. But as I listened, I found something very strange going on. It was almost as if Jordan Peterson and really the two sides of the audience had shown up for one type of conversation, one kind of debate, and Slavoj Zizek had shown up for an entirely different experience. The audience wanted to hear a discussion on Marxism, on left versus right, on which broad perspective on the problems on the world ultimately had the upper hand. And Peterson came for that debate. He came with an analysis of Karl Marx himself from the source material, the Communist Manifesto, which, at least on Marx's word, was the public pronouncement of what communism was. How can you do better refuting an idea in its pure form than to go straight to the primary source material? That's what I was always taught in academia, and that's what Jordan Peterson came to the conversation or debate to prove. He wanted to go through the ideas of Karl Marx and subject his very reasonable Jordan Peterson analysis to them. And the audience was ready for this. Jordan Peterson caught the applause and the negative reactions more or less at the expected time when he made a good point or kind of fumbled one. And for the most part, his ideas were the ones that we've heard coming from the mainstream neocons for well on 5 decades now. And I say that dismissively, but it's a perfectly passable critique. I certainly went through a lot of classic critiques of Marxism in my very own video on Marxism and capitalism released just 2 weeks ago. Clichés might be clichés, but that doesn't stop them from being accurate. And Jordan Peterson did a fairly good job repeating the arguments, at least to the point where after watching his opening statements, I was somewhat interested in how Slavoj Zizek would respond. And that's where things kind of got strange. Because as I probably should have expected, Slavoj Zizek didn't respond. He carried on his opening presentation, essentially waving away the problems with the Communist Manifesto and Marx's original teachings and thinkings. In his follow-up, he even alluded to the fact that he wasn't even really a Marxist, he was better described as a Hegelian, which was music to my ears at least, but nevertheless opened up questions about his identity as a Marxist and a communist. It seemed as though Slavoj Zizek was really less interested in defending Marxism as classically conceived, and more interested in critiquing, for lack of a better word, modernity, and the state of the modern world in its liberal, corporate, and post-industrial state. Of course, his fans cheered every time he made a good point, but strangely enough, the Peterson fans cheered after he made his good points too. For the most part, Zizek's points were ideologically neutral, at least as it came down to left versus right wing. More than that, Zizek's points seemed to have a thoroughgoing reactionary nature to them. They were in many ways more right-wing than Jordan Peterson's. There even came a point in Zizek's talk where he alluded to how much contempt he had for modern progressive identity politics and the modern progressive cultural grievances that have come to dominate the university. As expected, Jordan Peterson seemed rather confounded by Zizek's approach to the entire conversation, and in many ways I'm surprised that the audience wasn't more confounded as well. Of course, I've watched many Zizek lectures, and I know that his approach is a little bit screwball. I was expecting something like this. But what was more interesting to me is how his fans would react, because I felt that they were fundamentally not understanding what he was explaining to them about the modern world, about the modern state of the human condition. They were there because they thought he was one of them, because they saw him as a fellow Marxist. But once you so flippantly dismiss problems with the words of Karl Marx as immaterial to your own Marxism, how much of a Marxist are you? There was hardly an observation about the modern world that Zizek made that I didn't agree with as a reactionary. Moreover, Zizek was talking about problems that I rarely heard from orthodox Marxists, that I rarely heard from leftist activists, even leftist activist fans of Zizek himself. It seemed that my reactionary framework, and whatever framework Zizek was using, had a language to describe these problems that really wasn't available to most people on the left. I remember all through his talk, Zizek said that he wanted to hear Jordan Peterson tell a joke. "I want to hear you tell a joke," he would say. And of course, initially it seemed like this was some kind of breaking the ice technique, a way to put Peterson at ease. Obviously, Zizek himself wanted a much more laid-back conversation than the formal debate Peterson had prepared for, and that most people had come to watch. Still, as I heard him say that, I felt that maybe there was some kind of joke going on, a joke that I just couldn't see yet. Maybe one ultimately on Peterson, maybe a joke directed at something larger. And then I finally came to that infamous gotcha moment, the one that I had heard about endlessly on Twitter from every leftist who cared to comment on this debate. The moment where Slavoj Zizek asked Jordan Peterson to name the cultural Marxists. Slavoj Zizek said, I know who these people who you're against are, and I don't like them either. But I want to know, where is the Marxism in all of this? Where is the Marxism in these grievance studies and these identity politics? I don't see the Marxism anywhere. Where is it? And of course, very famously, Jordan Peterson had an overly vague and somewhat evasive answer. For a moment it did seem that cultural Marxism was a ghost that Jordan Peterson was chasing, a figment of his imagination. But in the context of everything Zizek said, his opposition to the modern academy, his understanding of the ultimately flawed nature of a materialist and purely economic view of humanity, his recognition, at least implicitly, of the deep flaws of classical communism. I felt that there was hanging in the air a much larger question, an extension of Zizek's own question. Where is the Marx in cultural Marxism? Where is the Marx in Slavoj Zizek's Marxism? Where is the genuine role of Karl Marx anywhere in this entire dialectic? It indeed seemed like the entire conversation was haunted by some kind of ghost. But the ghost was not Jordan Peterson's enemies, which were as real and as dominant as any intellectual movement could be in the modern academy. The ghost that seemed to haunt the amphitheater was Karl Marx himself, completely absent from any meaningful conversation having anything to do with the modern problems of humanity in the 21st century. Peterson's opponents were apparently in possession of a Marxism so mutated from its original form that it was barely indistinguishable from pure third world grievance mongering, and Zizek was apparently in possession of a Marxism that was so mutated from its original 19th century form it was virtually indistinguishable from neo-reactionary ideas of the problems in modernity. The only people who seemed to actually have a genuine desire to have classic Marxism were the leftist members of the audience. There at least seemed to be some implicit desire for the Marxism found in the Communist Manifesto. But even that ultimately seemed illusory. The whole endeavor felt like a LARP, felt like a session of live-action role-playing. Where were the communist intellectuals that actually took dialectic materialism seriously, the way it was discussed in the manifesto by Marx himself? At once the members of the audience, probably Marxists in their own right, seemed to have about as much relationship to classical Marxism as your average neo-pagan has to real religious practice in the pre-Christian era. It was mostly ephemeral window dressing. And as the conversations evolved, and evolved strangely enough into a discussion of Christ's sacrifice on the cross and grace, concepts that would be utterly alien to a 19th century materialist, the sensation that I was part of a giant joke reasserted itself. Slavoj Zizek kept on asking Jordan Peterson for a joke, but I felt like I was in the middle of one. Because as Slavoj Zizek continued to go on about grace and G.K. Chesterton's understanding of God himself being an atheist and the symbol of a cross, I genuinely began chuckling because I became convinced that Slavoj Zizek was really our guy. He was, at his core, a thoroughgoing reactionary. Whatever Marxist labels he took onto himself were more or less just an image he had cultivated, and whatever real ideas he had more or less boiled down to a general Hegelianism, applied in the original place Hegelianism was supposed to be used, the world of ideas, the world of idealism. Slavoj Zizek was parading around right-wing and reactionary ideas in front of a leftist audience, and they were applauding him every second of the way. It was hidden in plain sight, although I do get the impression that Jordan Peterson could tell what was going on by the end of the conversation. Now, Slavoj Zizek did make some great points against Jordan Peterson's general worldview, ones that I would agree with quite emphatically as a reactionary sympathetic individual myself. But all the while, more than the arguments being made, more than the discussion of whether Jordan Peterson's approach to the issues of modernity was really well suited, there was the joke that hung in the air. As much as the lumpen Marxists and online leftists like to think they got one over on Peterson, I think the joke was really on them. How much did they really internalize the ideas that Zizek was talking about? How much did they see, implicitly from his actions, the fact that the classical Marxist approach was more or less dead, a ghost? How could they see Slavoj Zizek's implicit reactionary nature throughout the talk? For a moment, it became like some kind of weird pre-1970s gay celebrity, Liberace, if you will, publicly, flamboyantly parading his homosexuality, only to have the references going completely over their own audience's head. No, man, Liberace only has those candelabras and flamboyant outfits because he's a real ladies' man. No, Freddie Mercury only has the tank top and the mustache because he's a real macho man. And to me, I think this is the joke that Slavoj Zizek was really asking for, the joke that was hanging implicitly in the air within this entire conversation, and the joke was entirely on the left. I know I've already spent far too long on this video, and there's probably much more to this conversation, but I'm left at least with one substantive point, one substantive thought beyond the implicit irony of it all that came from Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Zizek's conversation, and this was on the subject of implicit ideology, of ideas that we really don't choose to have, but that are given to us by history, that do take on a little bit of the nature of the Hegelian zeitgeist. I know that I myself am guilty of this, but I think many thinkers on the right are a little bit too quick to dismiss Hegel in his entirety. Once we get past the ridiculousness of Marx's materialistic application of his ideas, there is something profound there. Many of the ideas that we act out are things that are implicitly handed down to us. They're ideology. They're part of us whether we believe them or we don't. There is something of a Hegelian zeitgeist, a Jungian collective unconsciousness, a spirit of the collective humanity which mirrors the human's individual soul. Perhaps between myself and the left there is something of a dialectic playing out, a conversation that's going on implicitly between collectives. We are subject to the conflict of beliefs that we can't quite put into words, even though we struggle with language to do just that. Will there eventually be a conflict? Will there eventually be a synthesis? Is there some resolution in our future? I think it's hard to say. In many ways, I share Slavoj Zizek's pessimism more than anything else. But I think in order to move on, there needs to be some recognition of what people truly believe. What are the ideas that we believe in strongly enough to carry forward into our lives with vigor and fire and passion? What are the concepts of spirit and art that are real, that are living? What are the things that we are serious about? And what, in turn, are the ideas that we don't really care about? The positions we take on for humor or to make another person look stupid, and those ideas that we take on from a previous age that are really dead, that provide nothing we really want to bring into our own world, but simply serve to play a role, to give us an illusion that our lives are more heroic than they really are. In short, I think the resurrection, the reconciliation of our civilization lies only in this path, to recognize the true living spirit, and to leave behind the ghosts.